But to start us out, I just wanted to say that I think learning to write is a really challenging and difficult task. And so I don't think it's something that anyone just is born knowing how to do. It's really something that everyone has to practice. So even professional writers write and revise. Sometimes I think students think that we're just doing these things specific to English 098, when in reality we're actually going to be doing the things that writers at whatever level they're at practice pretty regularly. Now there's some sort of fan happening over here. Fareed, can you guys hear me in the back? This is loud enough? Okay. So in some ways, I think that I'm similar to traditional English teachers in that I do think grammar is important. I do think learning standard English is important. But I think in some other ways, I'm really different from a traditional English grammar teacher. We're really going to do an investigation into language and then try to apply our new understandings about language to different situations. So, for example, I'm not going to have you doing grammar worksheets. I've noticed, and other teachers have noticed, that we can teach grammar worksheets till we're blue in the face, and it basically has no impact on student writing. And it's something I think students actually kind of enjoy the worksheets. It's like there's a clear right and wrong answer, gets graded with numbers and points, right? Whereas writing is a much more complex task where you actually have to incorporate some understanding of language into that. And so we're not going to be focused so much on grammar worksheets, but on trying to investigate how language works. And so one of my goals this semester is for you guys to learn the tools that and sort of ways of thinking about language that are going to help you understand the expectations for writing in college. So there's a few sort of key concepts that we're going to talk about today. The first one is grammar, the second one is dialect, and the third one is we're going to combine register and genre. And you'll see that those are actually on the handout that I gave you. I had to start out and ask you guys, well, what is grammar? What would you say? What comes to mind when I say what is grammar? Words. This week. Writing. Okay. I would say that writing includes, writing always has a grammar. One second. It also has words. What were you going to say, Alex?
I was saying when you say grammar, I think of like periods, commas,
right.
colons.
So oftentimes grammar also includes punctuation, right? So on here I have the organization and structure of language that enables people to communicate with each other. So grammar specifically has to do with that organization and structure of language. So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about first. Traditionally, I think it's taught, Alex, as you had said, where does the comma go? What's a noun? What's a verb? Right? That's sort of traditional grammar instruction. And that's what I kind of want to move away from. Like, we're going to learn that, but along the way as part of this investigation into language. And so if I asked you guys, how is the word ain't used? What would you say? Like if you had to look at how people use the word ain't.
How the form of is not.
A form of is not, great. Okay, so we've got a synonym for it. Any other ideas about how ain't is used? Or reactions to the question?
Can't go, like most people say I ain't going.
So,
instead of properly saying that I can't.
okay, so, and this is interesting, you've distinguished it, as different from a sort of proper or standard English,
Yeah.
right? Yes, exactly. So as we're investigating language, we're going to be asking these kinds of questions. My goal is not for you guys to use ain't in an academic essay. It's a little too informal for that, right? But that we could actually look at the rules for how people use ain't. There are synonyms, there are rules for how it's used, just as we could for any kind of standard English. What I want to get away from is saying, like, oh, we're not allowed to use that word, or that word's not really in the dictionary. If it's a word that people speak and use, then it's a word that people use in communication, and we could study it in this class. We're going to look at a couple grammatical rules. And one grammatical rule is that you're not supposed to end a sentence with a preposition. But I want to show you guys how that doesn't have a whole lot to do with how people communicate. So if we look at two different sentence endings, does anyone see a preposition in this anywhere? Down, yeah. So using this grammatical rule, this grammatical rule says this is not an acceptable sentence ending, that you'd have to say the river down which Marlowe travels. But I can bet that if someone ended their sentence in either way, that we would all know what they meant. Marlowe is going down the river. Okay.
You say that.
You could say that too. I mean, I'm saying the meaning is the same, right? And if someone said the river that Marlowe travels down, you wouldn't look at them and like, huh, what are you talking about? People would understand that, right?
I understand the first one more than I understand the second one.
More than the second one even. Okay. So I guess what I'm saying is that some of these grammatical rules in English come from the 18th century when people were trying to make English more like Latin to try to make it more sophisticated. But the rules didn't necessarily have anything to do with how people use the English language. So some of these rules, like this one, which I would call a prescriptive rule telling you what you should do, doesn't have a whole lot to do with how people actually use the language. Okay. If we think about something like prescriptive grammar rules are kind of like table manners, right? They're telling you how you should eat, but table manners don't really describe how people actually eat. But it might be helpful, right, to know what are the expectations in a certain social situation so you could decide when it's okay to lick the food off your fingers, right? Because sometimes it's fine to do that. Sometimes it's fine to break the rules, even if that's, not the sort of official table manner appropriate way of eating. In the same way, right, so that I'm saying that this grammatical rule doesn't really describe how most people communicate, but it can be helpful to know what the rules are so you can know when it's appropriate to break them. What I want to move on from, though, are some other examples that look at what I would call descriptive grammar, which is also on this handout, which is rules of language that describe how people actually communicate. So, and I'm going to give you a few examples that might seem, hopefully these seem fairly obvious. The first one is that in the English language, usually if you have a regular noun, a person, place, or thing, you can make it plural by adding an S. So there are several students in the library. Several implies there's more than one. So the noun student becomes plural by adding an S. Right? And that's also a rule that describes how people communicate. I don't think that typically anyone would say there are several students in the library. Right? So this is how many people use that rule, right? It's a descriptive rule because it describes what people actually do. Another example of this with the, everyone should mind their manners. So everyone implies something that's plural. There's more than one person there. That's what's implied by everyone. And so manners becomes plural by adding the S here. I don't think in standard English, no one would say everyone should mind their manner. Right? That it would make, because everyone is plural, we'd add the S there. So those are just a couple examples of grammatical rules that actually describe how people communicate. But there are also grammatical rules for Englishes that are not standard English. So if we look at the sentence, he always be bothering me, okay? In standard English, maybe you'd say, well, the person hasn't used the correct form of to be. But if we look at African American English, this is actually following a rule for be. It's called the invariant be. When you use be in this way, it suggests that this thing happens more than once. It happens repeatedly. So he always be bothering me. This person is bothering you more than one time, maybe every day, multiple times. And so, right, the be here, this invariant be, is being used in a particular way. And so there's a rule governing the grammar of that sentence in the same way there's a rule governing the other sentences I put up here. We could also look at, I don't want none, okay? In standard English, someone might say, well, you have a double negative, okay? In African American English, a double negative is okay. It just adds emphasis. We know this person still doesn't want what has been offered to them, okay? If we look at rural Appalachian English, which is just like a rural mountainous area in the U.S., we'll notice that sometimes people there add an A in front of certain verbs. So they might say, it's time to go a-hunting, right? And so it's not that that's grammatically incorrect, it's that they're using a different grammatical rule, okay, in whatever language variety that they're speaking. So so the idea here is if we ask, is the sentence grammatical, we're asking, does it stick to a certain pattern? Does it stick to a certain rule of whatever language variety it's being written in or said in? And that standard English isn't any more right than any other version of English, it's just using a different set of rules. Yeah, Liz.
So how do you know which rule to go by?
Great question. So how do you know which rule to go by? So this has to do with what is the situation you're in, right? It has to do with whether you're speaking or writing, but also has to do with what you're writing for. So in this class, we're going to be writing a lot of essays, but in college, you might have other kinds of writing assignments. And I think they might have different expectations for, I don't know if I want to say the dialect, but we're going to talk a little, when we talk a little bit more about register, I think that'll get into a little more specifically what kind of language to use in college classrooms. I mean, I think that in general, most writing assignments in college are going to require some version of standard English. But even within standard English, there are lots of different varieties. So I think that's a really important question and one we should revisit when it comes time to look at different writing assignments in this class. So also, we're going to move on to, we've talked about grammar, we're going to talk a little bit about dialect next. So we've talked about dialect in this class already. What do you guys remember about dialect? Any guesses about what dialect is?
Form of English you're speaking.
Okay, so as an example, one dialect could be one form of English. We could have another dialect that's another form. I think, Susie, you mentioned different dialects, right?
Yes.
That you learned growing up, that were from different parts of China?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. Great. If we look at the handout in front of you, you've got a definition for dialect, a variety of language that's systematically distinct from other varieties. There's maybe one language, right? But there could be multiple dialects. And then as we move down here, we're going to talk about, even within those dialects, there could be multiple registers. But we'll get there in a moment. But yeah, so there's different varieties of any one language. And so as we're talking about different languages in this class, we might also be talking about different dialects. We're talking about different vocabulary, different pronunciation, different verb systems, different rules essentially for how language is organized. Usually dialects are spoken. Sometimes they're written down though. It depends on the dialect. And usually people who speak the same language can understand people who speak different dialects, but I think, Susie, you gave us the example of some dialects you really can't understand unless you speak that dialect, right? So I think it depends, right, on how different it is from the original language. Then thirdly, we're going to go into register and genre. So this is also on your handout. A register is talking about a collection of language features that are usually used for a particular kind of communication. So if someone says, oh, that's written in business speak, or that's written in political speak, they're talking about different registers, that there are different language styles that are used for different kinds of communications. So that's why I have register kind of under dialect here, because you could have one language, many dialects, and for each of those dialects you could have different registers. We're going to look at some examples of different kinds of registers. If you flip your page over, you'll see an example of register variation.